start with, could we have the emergency exit arrangements, please?
So again, for those joining us this afternoon, there is no anticipated fire drill, so if the alarm does go, we'll need to leave the building and we exit through the doors behind, downstairs, outside the assembly point, which is the second lamppost along. And I understand that in the event of that happening, there would be a member of staff to assist anybody that did need help in terms of first aid. Again, gents and ladies outside, and coffee available as and when there may be a break in the procedure. So.
Thank you. And mobile phones, could you please either turn them off or switch them to silent, please? Recording. Would there be any objections to this meeting being recorded? It certainly helps me when I come to write my report, so I take it that nobody's got any objection to that. Good, thank you. Microphones, just as you speak, if you could press the button and then press it again when you finish speaking. Right, well I think as there are a number of people here, I think for the first time it might be useful if we were to go around the table with introductions, and if I could start with the Borough Council, please.
David Phillips for Hastings Borough Council.
Emer Murphy for Hastings Borough Council. Emer, E-I-M-E-A-R, Murphy.
Deborah Gardner, Hastings Borough Council.
Laurie Davidson, Hastings Borough Council.
Ian Steele, Community Land Trust.
Keith Holly, John Borough from my clients schools in Macomb.
Laura Brooks, Sussex Wildlife Trust.
Martin Newbold, Friends of Speckled Advancement Trust and registered HMRC charity.
Roger Collier from Breebrook Terrace.
Chris Joyce from the Persons Surveillance Society. Bernard McGinley, local resident.
Paddy Historic Patricia Stevenson on behalf of the campaign to protect Rob Meadow from development.
Don Wise, probably the most experienced wildlife consultant in this room.
Yeah.
Or in the borough. Or Wingleton, or Community Land Trust.
I'm attending it as an individual.
Teresa Jarvis, attending as an individual.
Maureen Jarvis,
Thank you all very much. Well, we're turning our attention this afternoon to the historic and natural environment, including public and private open space. I would like to make one or two introductory remarks. But first of all, I would like to assure everybody, as I have already done, that I am fully aware of the value of the natural and historic assets of the borough. I'd like to turn to my report on the Hastings Planning Strategy, where at paragraph 54 I referred to the Highfield AONV, which includes the Hastings Country Park and the Hastings Cliffs SAC, the Marlene Valley Woods SSSI, the Coombe Valley Countryside Park, SNCIs and ancient and preserved woodlands. And then I talked about other open land, although without notation. It's for the most part exceedingly pleasant in character. And then at paragraph 56 I said, these constraints are valuable assets which give the borough its unique charm, character and appeal. So I do want to emphasise and assure people that I do understand the value of these assets, and I do also understand the value that people place on them. Obviously that's as has been pointed out, the planning framework has to be read as a whole, and the needs for development must not be forgotten. So it is a sort of a balancing act, and it's the council's undertaking to seek that balance. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we will be looking at each site which is being proposed to be allocated later on during this examination. Can I also remind people that main modifications were incorporated into the submitted planning strategy, which is now adopted, because during that examination I did feel that the strategy as submitted did not sufficiently emphasise the importance of various natural assets. So they were incorporated into the Hastings planning strategy, which has now been adopted. The other thing I want to mention is that I do want to finish this afternoon by 5 o'clock. I have a train to catch at 6. So I must ask everybody if they would please keep to the point. There's no need for repetition. So I'm in your hands as well. He may well be in my hands as regards that. So please stick to the point. Good. Yes, Mr. Ingleton.
I just wanted to say on 4.1, you say dealing with each asset, how important to the borough, its historic assets, listed buildings and conservation areas. I think they ought to say historic assets, listed buildings, heritage assets and conservation areas.
Yeah, I mean, I can't alter the...
I'm just saying.
Yeah, okay, yes, thank you for that. Yes. Right. Well, the council, again, and I'm grateful for this, has given me a very comprehensive reply to my question 4.1, which is this. Dealing with each one, how important to the borough are its historic assets, e.g. listed buildings and conservation areas, and its natural assets, e.g. ancient woodlands, sites of special scientific interests, and other open land, including public and private open space. Does the plan accord them sufficient protection in accordance with the framework and the planning strategy? That's the adopted planning strategy that was examined just over a year ago. So, Borough Council, did you wish to amplify or add to anything to your response in the light of the representations which have been made?
If I may very briefly, sir, I think you just referred to the adopted strategy being adopted just over a year ago. It was adopted February this year.
Yes.
Actually.
Yes.
So very recent adoption. As you say, we've endeavoured to give a comprehensive response. And I think I would just like to flag 2 or 3 things in there before handing over to people for comments, and then for my colleagues to my left to respond to any specific either site or policy-specific elements.
Right.
But firstly, sir, and our response is framed in such a way that we have, with no rank or importance intended, dealt with the natural environment first. But at para 4.1.3, sir, that is just to confirm, for the avoidance of any doubt, that following your recommended main modifications to us, we have proposed and now adopted 3 new policies, that is EN4, EN5 and EN6 of the strategy, which deal with ancient woodland, local nature reserves and local wildlife sites. Moving then to a not dissimilar comment in respect to the historic and heritage assets, you will see at 4.1.21 in our submission, the inspector, obviously that is yourself, sir, in this case, dealing with the strategy, considered that the approach set down in that policy, as proposed to be modified, provided sufficient protection, preservation and enhancement of the built environment. So, in essence, what we are looking at, sir, is where the development management plan has taken the strategy forward, in particular with its site allocations and the potential impact of those allocations on some of these assets, and whether or not those are appropriately phrased and protected within the policies put forward in this, when taken in conjunction with those that are already in the adopted strategy.
Thank you.
I didn't know, sir, whether it would be best for Ian Murphy to add a little bit to that and then open up to discussion so we can
as you so wish,
flash out where the areas of concern are.
Yes. Yeah.
So you'll read from the document that we produced that we've set out how the policies sit in alignment with the National Planning Policy Framework and also the accompanying electronic National Planning Policy Guidance, here referred to as the PPG. We've also taken account of the recently concluded consultation on the advice notes that English Heritage issued during the summer. They went out for consultation until September this year. We're not yet aware of when those notes will make their way through to the public domain and to material considerations, but we have, out of due diligence, considered how all matters put forward for each of the sites have followed through with that theme and vein of sustaining, enhancing, protecting the heritage environment.
Yeah. Anything further from the council at this point? Right, well, who would like to back first? Yes, Mr.
May I say, Chris Joyce, President of the Society. Yes. I don't think, forgive me if I'm mistaken, that we've had the benefit of seeing those amendments, those policy amendments. I don't know if anybody else has. I don't think we have. But what I'd like to say, sir, is that although as a society we broadly welcome those enhancements to the policy, we still feel, I think, just on the basis of what I've heard, that in actual practice the council still fails fully to appreciate the nature and the value of the historic assets that it has in the town and the possibilities for the future which they represent commercially, among other things. I just wanted to add that.
Yes, we were looking at tourism this morning, and we looked at the relationship between conservation areas, listed buildings, etc., and their contribution to the economy via tourism. Right. Yes, Mrs. Stevenson.
I'm going to refer to something that it does relate to the site we're concerned about, but it does show that some things happen which are really worrying. This does go back to 2009. I noticed that Robsat Wood had been excluded from the Strategic Open Spaces designation. So I emailed Mr. David Dine, and I said to him, you may recall I wrote to you in February this year regarding the omission of your outlining Robsat Wood in green on the local development framework maps that were used in public exhibition, and you were replying for me that this was an error and that the plans had been already corrected for use in further public exhibitions. You went on to say, you assured me that you are aware that Robsat Wood is part of the Churchwood LNR, includes ancient woodland, and is also covered by Woodland Tree Preservation Order, and that it forms part of the town's designated strategic open space. However, I have very recently received an email from Tim Cookson who states that Robsat Wood does not form part of the town's designated strategic open space, and that was the reason it was not included in the green hatched areas on the map. I am not at all happy with this conflicting information and request a response. So on the 10th of August 2009, David Dine emailed me and said, thank you for your email regarding Robsat Wood and the strategic open space designation. At the time of your first email regarding Robsat Wood's omission from the exhibition board, I thought that I had made a mistake in leaving it off, as there had been comments about this after the boards had been printed the week before the exhibition. However, I have only recently discovered, in fact, it wasn't an omission, as Robsat Wood is not on the list of strategic open spaces, and therefore the exhibition boards were correct. Now, I think that's a pretty shocking example of, I'm not quite sure what reasons, but we all know that Robsat Wood is part of Churchwood. They're both local nature reserves, they're both ancient woodlands, and they are actually supposed to be both listed as SNCRs. And I still have never found out the reason why Mr. Cookson suddenly wrote to me and said, oh no, it's not a mistake, it's not part of the strategic open spaces designation. And I was a bit green then, but I've learned a lot more now, and I think that's an example of how little value at that time was given to these very important sites. Robsat and Churchwood are extremely important historical sites, and yet somebody decided that that was not to be in that strategic open spaces designation, and it's a mystery. It still is a mystery.
Well, all I can do, Mrs. Stevenson, is to assure you that I will be making a site inspection. It will be accompanied, and I will be looking not just at the site, but also the surroundings to see how the site complements, I think it does, the surroundings. So I think a lot will depend on my site inspection, and I will invite you there to point things out to me. But certainly I will take all those matters into account. It will be a thorough site inspection.
I'm not actually raising this because it's RobSat. I'm raising it because it's one example of many where I don't think this council is actually adhering to their promises to protect ancient woodland, local nature reserves, or other important spaces. It's not just because of RobSat, but this is one example I can actually prove that something untoward happened. I won't mention RobSat again, but that is, to me, a glaring example of irresponsible behaviour.
Well, all I can do is to assure you that it will be looked at on site in a very responsible way. Yes,
Yes, first of all, it's about a hearing matter that came up in two of the hearings. I just wanted to clarify that, and I think that would help to clarify the situation.
Yes, but, I mean, we've got a lot to deal with.
If we can just keep it, I'll keep it brief. We did say that there were 1,500 signatures required. That was part of a constitution by the council to actually get a matter into the committee meetings.
Look, Mr. Newbold, I really don't want to get involved in that. I mean, as I've explained to you on numerous occasions, what is in front of me is a local plan which has been produced by a democratically elected authority. I really don't want to get into all the what appear to be machinations as to how it was produced.
No, it wasn't.
Would you please keep to the agenda?
That wasn't what I was trying to do, sir.
Well,
but I'll keep to the agenda if you'd like.
Yes, please keep to the agenda.
Okay. I'll be using Focus Area 12 to demonstrate HBC's failure to follow the Habitats Directory to provide sufficient protection as set out in the NPPF guidelines and Hastings Strategy. Speckled Wood is a 12.7 acre site that was formed when ashdown beds were laid down in Hastings. It was identified as ancient woodland on Euclid and Gardner's 1787 map of Hastings. Speckled Wood, known in the development plan as Upper Ore Valley, CV01, CV03, CV04, does not appear in ecological reports in the development management plan or core examination library, save one out-of-date report and the GI study 2012. Speckled Wood appears at the centre of Focus Area 12 and gives the area its main identity. The only ecology report provided for Focus Area 12 is for CV01, the only site with outline planning consent, and where Section 106 has not been signed. This is due to multiple owners not in agreement. The SHAR update, April 2014, does not include CV01, CV03, CV04 or any of the land area. There has been no agreement from all landowners. There had never been adequate ecology study carried out from the non-perspective of planning.
I'm going to stop you again because, as I said in my introduction, we will be looking at each and individual site as we go through the examination.
But I'm trying to give you reasons why I do not believe this plan is sound, and I'm doing this by actually pointing out the errors which have not been done on one site. And if I'm allowed the latitude to continue, I can show that the ecology and none of the work has been done. And basically, how can you then make a decision whether you put houses on a site if the ecology hasn't been done?
Well, as I say, we will look at that when we consider those particular sites.
But it's important to ascertain whether the work has been correctly done as part of this process to actually see whether we are actually in the ballpark of actually doing this correct. And I don't believe we are. The sequential testing for the site allocations carries one-line analysis sections stating the areas with Focus Area 12 are more vulnerable under their NPPF vulnerability classifications. Hastings Environmental Policy Theme 1 to 6 inclusion has not been adequately applied. That's HSDMP 141. Hastings Biodiversity Action Plan 2006-2009 has not been applied to this site. Speckled Wood does not appear in Hastings Local Plan Development Management Plan Habitats Regulation Assessment Screening Report, DMP 155. Parks and Spaces Strategy DMP 144 does not include Speckled Wood, yet it was declared an open space for public use in 1930 at the same time as Alexandra Park. The Hastings Borough Council Ancient Woodland Survey report, page 27, uses vascular plant indicators to identify ancient woodland from a list of 100 species, stating that they are strongly associated with ancient woodland and typical components of botanically rich ancient woodland. Focus Area 12 contains all of these taxon, including it is a botanical rich ancient woodland. Focus Area 12 is also mentioned in GI study, page 18, paragraph 5.25, where the importance of this site is documented in the Green Infrastructure Network. The only ecology document to be found in the examination library was misnamed from the outset, HSDMP 162. According to the author of this report, the ecology consultation, regular updates are necessary to monitor this major changes in this area. This document is dated 2009. It is clear from this that the only recent ecology reports have been carried out by members of Friends of Speckled Wood Management Trust and HMRC charity in association with the Sussex Wildlife members and professionals through their iRecord site. 200 species of rare and protected taxon have been identified by specialists in the field on this site. That's Exhibit 216321. It is concerning that there is no process for gathering ecological data by organisations for this site. Through the lack of professional ecology reporting, criminal activities have occurred on this site and been reported to the police. These activities have detrimental effect on the important wildlife, flora and fauna of this site. It is very clear that further investigations are required of this site.
Well, we will look at that again, as I say, when we consider those particular sites. Yes, Mr. Hollidge.
Yes, I'd just like to echo Simon's and Mrs. Stevenson's comments about the inadequacy of the investigation of potential sites of nature conservation interests, amongst others. And I refer you to a letter I wrote to Mr. Cookson, who was then the Strategic Planning Manager, in his Appendix G of my submission. It was dated the 12th of March 2013. And at point 4, I say, please provide a copy of the extract of the local plan inspector's report, which relates to the omission of this site, as that provided clearly relates to a different piece of land, possibly being that to the south of Bohemia, and I never had a response to that. It appears that to say the process of looking at these sites is somewhat haphazard is an understatement. I did make a Freedom of Information request to the Borough Council, which I now have, and as part of that answer that they've given me, they say the validation process for all sites of nature conservation is a panel of experts, and they list a few of those, which includes Mr. Davidson here. And I'd just like to ask, as Mr. Wise rather modestly described himself as being the foremost consultant on ecology and wildlife in the area, and certainly from a development perspective, and I've been working in the town since about 2003, he's recognised as the Badger Man, and I just sort of fail to understand why he's not on this panel, and certainly that would have applied in relation to Mr. Newbold's site, where I believe there are badger sets which have been interfered with and destroyed, and I just find it odd that he's not included there. And I'd also like to ask, and I've got a whole host of questions, but I'll just do a few at a time if I may. And part of that FOI response was that an ecological survey of my client's land had been carried out by Mr. Davidson. And I'd just like to know what type of survey that was and what the process was. I did also ask to be advised as to under whose instruction Mr. Davidson carried out that survey, but the answer from the council is rather fudged. It says that as departmental responsibilities and personnel here at Hastings have changed much since 1996. I'm unable to advise you under whose instruction this work carried out, but I suspect Mr. Davidson will probably be able to recall that and provide me with that information. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Sear. Yes, you're from the Ore Valley Community Trust.
Or Community Land Trust.
Yeah, could you tell me just a little bit about your trust and its relationship or its responsibilities or whatever with Speckled Wood, please?
Well, the Community Land Trust is, if you like, the long line of organisations that were set up in 2005 to campaign to save Speckled Wood, and started off with the Speckled Wood group working alongside Sad Owls. Then Ore Valley Action was formed, and Ore Valley Action formed Ore Community Land Trust in 2009 specifically to acquire land in the Valley. So it was a campaign to save the woodland and get it redesignated as far as possible as protected urban green space. There was also practical work to clear footpaths and the street, remove huge amounts of rubbish and generally clean up the area so that the community could make better use of it.
Right.
And finally, it was it moved into looking at projects to enhance the woodland for community use. It isn't just about preserving the woodland, it's about making best use of the community. So I think in a nutshell, that's what my group has been involved in.
Thank you.
And the point I wanted to make really is that I think most of us who've been involved in campaigning for green spaces in Hastings have had lots of reasons to be dissatisfied with processes in the past, and certainly the Parks and Open Spaces strategy that was developed some years ago also led Speckled Wood out of it, even though it was a potential green space, partly because of the areas designated for housing development. So there was quite a lot of general campaigning to get, if you like, a more proactive view about open space, and particularly areas of urban space that are valuable to local communities, which I think increasingly nationally there's a recognition that these areas are important, if not more important, than countryside open spaces because they affect all people's lives. So we've been seeking to, one, protect Speckled Wood, and two, get a much stronger awareness, if you like, of the importance of small and medium-sized public open spaces, green spaces and woodland. And I suppose I'm going to say something slightly more positive. Although a lot of things have been done wrong in the past, I think the idea of the plan is to improve things in the future. In other words, we have got quite positive proposals for protecting at least some of the land of Speckled Wood, not all we want, but a step forward from where we are at the moment. And the proposals generally for protection and recognition and listing of open spaces seem to be pointing in the right direction, but there is obviously a long way to go. It's going to require a sea change in, I believe, the attitude of the planning department or the responsive planning system to recognise these important priorities, and proactive work. In other words, positive work should be done to help local communities identify open spaces, look at ways of enhancing them and improving them, and learn a lot from what's been done in urban areas, cities and places like London, where very small spaces have often been enhanced to make massive contributions to the local environment. So I see some positives in this, but it will require a big modal shift, if you like, and obviously from our point of view we're desperately keen to ensure the maximum protection for Speckled Wood, which is it's not all we want, but it's better than it was.
Right. I mean, do you think the policies should be strengthened in the development management plan? If so, how?
Yes, I think they probably could be, in that I think there could be a lot more proactive comments along the lines of what I was talking about, really, about actively seeking to identify and list potential areas of open space and working with local communities to look at options for those spaces. Now, that sort of approach is being taken now about other historical assets, I believe. There's a movement forward on that, and I think the same thing could happen in terms of public open space. So I think, yes, there's a lot of positives in here, but I think it could be improved, certainly.
With a new policy or with a strengthening of existing ones, or a combination of both?
Probably a combination of both.
Right. I have been known to set homework. Would you like to think about that and hopefully by 5th of December let me have a suggested draft policy along the lines that you are suggesting.
Happy to do that.
Please, yes, and also have a look at the existing policies in the revised proposed submission version, and then obviously everybody will have an opportunity of commenting on it. And if you could let me have that by the programme officer by the 5th of December, that would be very useful. So thank you. Yes, Mr. Wise.
Yes. One, I've noted, Mr. Horrocks, that you keep telling us that the council is democratically elected. That's true, but there's not one of these people in front of me who formed the borough plan. None of them are democratically elected. They are appointed by a senior official. They're not democratically elected. I'm sorry. Am I wrong?
Well, I really don't want to get into the administrative arrangements of local authorities. I mean, the fact is the council is democratically elected.
No, only the councillors.
Well, yeah.
And can I get on to the second point? The second point is key principles from Planning Policy Guidance 9, biodiversity and geological conservation. Regional planning bodies and local planning authorities should adhere to the following key principles to ensure that the potential impacts of planning decisions on biodiversity and geological conservation are fully considered. Now, I won't go tell you all because you've probably seen it all, but the next thing I'm going to say is Hastings Borough Council was the first and remains the only district or borough authority in East Sussex to employ a full-time ecologist and nature reserve officer to ensure the council is at the forefront of biodiversity conservation locally and to promote biodiversity issues within the local community. There's miles of it.
Right, okay.
Well, my point is that we're not going down those paths. We haven't got an ecologist anymore, for a start. No, he's not. He's not. He's far above being an ecologist now.
Yes.
Yes, it's about the designation of the northern part of the convict grounds as private open space.
Right.
I've put forth a number of reasons in my statement. I just wanted to add two further reasons.
Yes, okay, right, yes.
They are the core strategy informal consultation in 2011 referred to the high level of HMOs in the town, and in 4.11 it stated further 85% of HMOs are concentrated in Braybrooke, Gensing, Central St Bernard's and Castle wards, and I mean 3 of those wards abut the green space, which is the White Rock Gardens and the convent grounds. And I'm not sure about Braybrooke, but they're the 4 wards in closest proximity to that open space. And one further point is the importance of potentially the convent and its grounds and the White Rock Gardens once the pier reopens. And a White Rock Trust has been formed, which, when my mother is involved with it, but she's not one of the lead members of it, but by the people who, mainly by Jess Steele, she was behind the raising money for the pier.
Right.
And they are including the convent and its grounds in their area of interest, along with White Rock Gardens.
Right, okay.
And so,
emphasising, you know, the potential for tourism.
Right, yes. Right, is there anybody? Yes. Sussex Wildlife Trust.
Yes, Laura Brooks, Hastings Wildlife Trust. I just wanted to highlight the concerns we know and rep to you, that we're concerned that the natural environment and the natural assets needed to actually deliver sustainable housing in Hastings are going to be compromised by some of the allocations that are suggested in this local plan. Just to highlight this, because as the plan currently stands, there are 3 allocations adjacent to triple SIs, 5 allocations adjacent to local wildlife sites, 5 allocations in local wildlife sites, 15 allocations adjacent to local wildlife sites, 2 allocations currently in ancient woodland, 10 adjacent to ancient woodland, 2 adjacent to priority habitats, and 5 allocations adjacent to local nature reserves. We really question whether the allocations that are adjacent to or on existing sites designated for their biodiversity value are sitting in line with the NPPF guidance, particularly Section 109, Section 114, Section 117 and Section 165. We've recognised that the Hastings Borough Council have carried out a green infrastructure strategy, and they've clearly made reference to the Natural Environment White Paper, recognising the value of connected, joined up, resilient ecological networks. And therefore, with these allocations in these sites that form part of their green infrastructure network, we are concerned that there are potential severances in that network. And therefore, we're unclear how it sits with some of their objectives, especially Objective 3A and 3C of the Hastings Planning Strategy, which highlights the importance. 3A, for example, says protecting and enhancing and improving the quality of the town's biodiversity, in particular sites of international, national, regional and local nature conservation importance. And there, for example, LRA 1 that sits within the plan, I know that's a specific allocation, but it says the allocation is adjacent to a local wildlife site, whereas actually when you look at the GIS layer and the data, it's actually partly on a local wildlife site.
Right.
So those are the concerns, it's the holistic overall view that there are certain severances within the green infrastructure network, and as a result the strategy, it doesn't feel it's embedded in this process. It feels perhaps potentially there's options where it's feeling a bit like a retrofit for some of these allocations, whereas we feel the green infrastructure strategy should really be there, and if the objectives are to be met in the planning strategy, then those allocations should be looking to enhance and not potentially sever that network.
Right, and also, as I understand it, you're saying that we shouldn't just be looking at these sites in isolation, but the way that they relate to the surroundings and other open space to form networks.
Yeah, I mean, I do recognise from looking at the allocations and their policies that there's usually a bullet point within that policy that says, you know, there will be an ecological opportunities and constraints requirement reports as part of any development that goes forward. But I think it's a shame that that's not carried out before some of these site allocations go forward, because it may be that these opportunities and constraints highlight things that therefore Hastings can't deliver their housing numbers on those sites, and would therefore be sort of questioning the soundness of the suitability of some of these sites.
Right, okay. I mean, are you questioning the suitability of all the sites that you've set out under paragraph 4 of your statement? That's 3 adjacent to SSSIs, and then 5, 15, 2, 10, 2, 5.
Yeah, we're suggesting, I mean, particularly the sites that are actually on sites currently designated for their biodiversity value. I mean, these are ones that sites we have looked at that are actually sites that are currently recognised and designated for their biodiversity. It doesn't mean that there aren't other site allocations that could still compromise the green infrastructure strategy network. But yeah, there are particular ones, and especially sorts of allocations that are in local wildlife sites and things like that, we do have real concerns about the cumulative impact, especially when some of them also sit adjacent to other priority habitats.
Thank you. Yes, Mrs. Scott.
In the development management plan, the council should make a commitment that all buildings recognised as being of townscape merit in the draft 2007 St Leonard's on Conservation Area appraisal by Nicholas Antrim will be included in the borough's forthcoming list of non-designated heritage assets. The council should also make a commitment in the plan to include that all views, townscapes and spaces which Nicholas Antrim recognises as being of significance. That's a suggestion that they include those.
Yes, Mr. Newbold.
Yes, can the inspector tell me, because I can't find any details of this at the moment, but I understand there was a ruling that went through last night about antisocial behaviour orders concerning Japanese knotweed and the fines on landowners and on companies up to £20,000.
It's a ruling last night.
That's what I understand.
I've not come across it, I must admit.
And obviously this has some major impact on whether the sites are viable.
Right, okay. If you could get me some information.
I have been trying. Yeah, I have been trying.
Preferably in print, you know, a copy of a ruling or whatever it is.
Okay.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, I will try.
Yeah, good. Yes, Ms. Jarvis.
I don't know if I need to raise this now because I have put it in my statement, but it was just very minor, two minor things. One was there's a mistake in the plan. 6 to 8 Ellensley Road are in the Kings Road Conservation Area, but are not included in the conservation area on the policies map. And so that's just a mistake. And the other issue is the exclusion of 1 to 3 Chapel Park Road from the Kings Road Conservation Area. It appears to be totally illogical because in his draft 2007 draft appraisal, Nicholas Antrim identifies 1 to 3 Chapel Park Road as being of townscape merit and recommends their inclusion in the adjacent conservation area. As along with 6 and 7 Ellensley Road, they are particularly prominently cited and overlooked and are visible from the area of the Square Station. And now that 6 and 8 Ellensley Road are included in the conservation area, subsequently included, but 1 to 3 were not. 1 to 3 Chapel Park Road are now immediately adjacent to the Kings Road Conservation Area on 3 sides. And it just seems a somewhat absurd exclusion, really, given how prominently they cited they are in relation to the... So, I mean, or if that can't be done within the context of this plan, perhaps there could be a commitment to include them if that has to go, you know, to the elected members.
Yes, I mean,
without change.
Alterations to designation of conservation areas or any proposed extensions to them, I mean, there is a separate and distinct process for that rather than...
And that has to be democratically... whatever.
Yes, I mean, there is a set process for it.
Yeah, okay, so...
But obviously, I mean, dealing with looking at any particular site, one would have to take into account whether or not it was in a conservation area at present, or even whether it was next to it. So that would be a consideration.
Should be.
Right. Yes, Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to draw your attention to NPPF paragraph 109, which says the planning system should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment by protecting and enhancing valued landscapes. Well, since that was published, the council, in its usual way, has proceeded to ignore that furiously in cases such as Chapel Park Road, Ashbourne Road, even Archery Road. And what we have as a standard response from the council, I think, is a form of lip service that might even become a form of hand-wringing but really it's not acceptable, and there are policies in the plan that would be in breach of this particular part of the NPPF, and the one I mentioned previously, EN86. EN8C, sorry, not 6, EN8C, which omits White Rock Gardens, which is a central feature, central attraction of the borough. Thank you.
Right, anything else before I ask the councillor? Yes, Mr Newbold.
Yes, I'd like to ask the council in relation to the Hastings local plan sequel testing of the site allocations. I believe this was touched on in the previous meeting, but we have some printouts that we've actually had now taken of this, and you can see that there is a large section down that list which is all red, indicating that sites have not had site profiles.
Which document is this?
This is DMP 157. You can see that there's a large red block which basically denotes the site profiles required, yes or no. They haven't been done on the majority of the sites. In addition to this, a lot of the sites are also declared with a vulnerable classification from the NPPF. I'd like to know, as this seems to be a long list of different sites and a lot of the information seems the same on these sheets, how the council's come to the decision which sites are viable and which sites aren't.
Is this from a nature conservation point of view?
No, sir, I don't think it is. If it helps.
Right.
But I think it is.
Yes, Sussex Wildlife.
Yeah, Laura Brooks, Sussex Wildlife Trust. I just wanted to mention in relation to some of our points as well, sort of going back to the evidence base, and perhaps a more proactive way forward with some of these allocations would be to revisit the Green Infrastructure Strategy document that's done in December 2012, or published in December 2012, and because the strategic management plan, we talk about the proactive connections of some of these sites. I know there's talk about cycle paths and cycleways, doing that's part of the green infrastructure network, but I think the sites, again, that are designated for biodiversity value, and the evidence base that's been used on that needs to be relooked at, and perhaps the council could be forward thinking within that plan and set out themselves how they would like to see greater connections of those sites, specifically those biodiversity sites. So again, there's potentially the prospect that proposed sites won't be severed, and then it's a case of development going ahead on sites that can then contribute to it. It could be more forward thinking so that we can better plan where those sites are going to go.
Yes, Mrs Stevenson.
I'm referring back to Sussex Wildlife Trust's comments, and it is quite worrying to see how many sites are either in, adjacent, or beside, or whatever, these important habitats and sites. But the thing that worries me most of all is that time and again these situations come up for planning and they're passed, and it's always because they have mitigation strategies in place, right? Well, that is bad enough in itself, that you want to mitigate against wildlife in such an area as what we're fighting for. But what then happens is nobody checks up on these mitigation strategies. There's evidence in Hawthorne Road that the badgers up there, which are being completely pushed off their foraging area, ripped up all the newly laid turf in these dreadful flats they've built, or whatever you want to call them. So we have these things that highlight the seriousness of putting these sites within these very important places, and then the council say, okay, we'll put conditions on it. And then you go along when it's being built or being built, and you can see that no such thing has happened. They are ignored, and that is my very big concern here, that the council do not follow up. They say they don't have to, it's down to the developer. And all across the borough, you see these sites that be built in inappropriate places, and the wildlife are not being looked after. The mitigation is just, that's it, it doesn't matter. It's happened with the Hastings, the Bexhill Bypass Road. We know that badgers there have suffered terribly. Now, I'm not sure if that's down to Hastings or ESCC to watch that, but the badgers were given artificial sets which were too small, they couldn't get into them, and they were seen foraging around in the field full of manure. They have said that the great crested newts have died because they were not mitigated properly, and this happens across the borough, that they give these planning applications out with these mitigation conditions attached, and they are ignored frequently. And nobody in the council seems to care about it. Once the application's been passed, the developer's got his digger out there, that's the end of it. And numerous times, dreadful things have been reported. Dead badgers and what have you, and I think that's a serious omission on the part of this council. As long as they get their development passed, they're not interested after that, that's it. Mitigation, that's the end of it. They do not check up to see if it's done properly.
Mr. Ingleton.
I'm obviously concerned about the heritage asset situation. What we've got is we've got some new sections in the document here, HN1, 3, 4 and 5, but what we've got is the NPPF with 126 and 141, and I think should take precedence. So what's happened is we've got the ones that are the policies in here have made what I call simple procedure difficult. So demolition of heritage assets should not occur before all the proper procedures are complied with. This has been set up as another developer-friendly scheme. What's been happening all the way along the ridge is the buildings of real quality there have been demolished, and we've had these 4-storey blocks of flats, 14 of them, so they don't provide any social homes. All the way along there, we've had this situation. Interesting quality buildings being knocked over and demolished. I've got another example here of in the allocations, we've got Mount Dennis and Pine Hill on page 131, and there is very clear, which is alongside of the ridge there, and there are 3 buildings there, 2 of them of quality and 1 of them isn't. But the 2 buildings of quality there. But if you read through the site allocation, there's no mention of them being a heritage asset, and they are both quality buildings. So what I'm saying is the site allocations haven't been properly done, and heritage assets don't seem to be a priority of the council.
So when we look at each and every proposed allocation, can we bear that in mind?
Yes.
And I will ask, are there any...
I will bring some photographs.
Right. Well, I will ask whether there are any heritage assets on these sites, either natural or historic, that should be taken into account in the criteria in the policies. Yeah. So that's. Thank you. Yes, Mrs. Brown.
Thank you. Sufficient provision to protect open space. I believe there isn't sufficient provision, and I'm not quite sure what to do about it, and I'll explain why. I'm talking particularly about the West Hill area. Sometime earlier in this century, the council in its wisdom decided to provide a lot of kickabout areas, which is very laudable. However, unfortunately, one of them they chose was on the West Hill, and they wanted to fence bits of it off so that they could have a kickabout area there. There was a terrific public outcry, and I'm very pleased to say that the council backed down. But after that, I wondered how we could safeguard the West Hill, and I did get in touch with English Heritage, who said they couldn't do anything at all. However, they had on a previous occasion, English Heritage said that we have the advantage in Hastings of 3 green fingers: East Hill, West Hill, and the White Rock Gardens. And so the West Hill obviously is terribly important, and I'm not sure how we could safeguard it in the future, because as it did have, could have had fencing on there. Fencing could possibly become development, and it could be nibbled away at in the future, bearing in mind, and I know you're going to say again, we're going to discuss areas separately, but the West Hill area is scheduled for, West Hill area, for 50 to 60 dwellings, which we've already complained about. So I'm feeling very unsure about the future of the West Hill as a whole.
Yes, Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, sir. I'd just like to bring the discussion round to the question of the built environment again, and perhaps pick up a few issues that you've touched on this afternoon. One of them is that I think that the borough needs to have an integral approach to the question of natural environments and the built environment in particular. Of course, the heritage assets of the town. It would be absurd to have a situation where we had excellent conservation and management of natural environments, if that could be achieved, and obviously there are a lot of doubts expressed this afternoon about that. Absurd to have that on the one hand, and a situation where built heritage assets were demolished or became unkempt in the town. And so I do think the two things really need a borough-wide view and an integrated approach. And indeed, one of the problems I think that we've encountered in Burton St Leonard's Society is that lack of an integrated approach. We see it as a lack of vision on the part of the council. I'd just very briefly like to make a few points about our society, just to clarify, because there may be some misconceptions. We don't welcome an adversarial approach. We obviously wish to collaborate as far as possible with the Borough Council, and we recognise the resource constraints that are upon them, as indeed upon most local authorities. But we do think that the council lacks vision, and in particular, I think, aspiration. I think that there is a strong case for seeing Hastings as one of the great historic towns of this country, and possibly even seeing it in an international context as such. Our society's constitution requires us to look not only at the historic area of St Leonard's, but borough-wide, and that was a very far-sighted, I think, provision in our constitution in relation to the points I'm making about the integrity of the town's assets. But in particular, of course, and the late Nick Antrim brings this up very well in his submission to the council, and of course in the much expanded Pevsner section, he brings up the point that Burton St Leonard's is a unique, absolutely unique planned Regency town, and it is a whole. Although it's very diverse architecturally, and in the heart of it are some recently restored gardens, it's a unique asset, and we could argue, I think, quite convincingly that important as Hastings Old Town is, that Burton St Leonard's has an equal claim. And the Borough Council has, I think, so far failed to recognise that. If I could mention also your reference to site visits, I don't know whether you're proposing to make visits in the Burton St Leonard's area, but I can specify very, very precisely. The original part of Burton St Leonard's is the seafront, the two colonnaded sections of the seafront, and they are in an abject condition, and it is quite shocking because that is both metaphorically and in fact literally the shopfront of St Leonard's, and it could be a major attraction. There are numerous improvements that would require resources, but if there were the will to do something about it, that would be a major and a necessary improvement, and we haven't detected the sufficient will on the part of the council to recognise that. I'd very much welcome a visit by you, sir, to that area in particular.
Certainly, yes.
Thank you.
I would like to do that. In fact, I did have a good walk around Burton St Leonard's when I was examining the planning strategy, and I have seen just very recently the inside of a certain hotel on the front there. So,
yes. Also, of course, so we might point out that, just as an illustration of what we see as a piecemeal approach, which is, I think, dogged Hastings since the Hastings and St Leonard's since the war. The gardens have been beautifully restored at some expense recently, but in a sense that is a kind of piecemeal initiative. There's no relationship between that very much welcome restoration and the view or the approach to Burton St Leonard's as a whole, nor is there recognition that Burton St Leonard's shades out, of course, into the later 19th century St Leonard's, and that there is a reciprocal relationship between the two. And this, I think, relates to the issue you raised about tourism, and I understand that you discussed that this morning. But we think that there is more potential both in tourism and in other respects to attract new income, new capital and new income into the town by this integral approach to the historic built environment. We've recommended in our written submission to you, sir, two new policies. Very briefly, they were an explicit recognition of the importance of Burton St Leonard's, and enhancement of the character and integrity of it. I did notice in the council statement today the use of the word enhance, which we welcome, but we'd obviously want to see in much more detail what is meant by that. We also felt that there should be a supplementary plan aimed specifically at supporting and enhancing the historic character of the area, and that there should be a management plan for each of the conservation areas, in fact, in accordance with the English Heritage Guidelines. Those are the main points that I wanted to make, sir. We certainly welcome any approach by the council, which I think starts to recognise much more fully than has been the case hitherto the extraordinary assets which we have in the heritage of the built environment, in particular, of course, the heritage of localities such as Burton St Leonard's. Thank you.
Well, I certainly will have a look around Burton St Leonard's, and if you'd like it to be accompanied, that can be arranged.
Yes, I think we very much welcome that. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah. Look forward to it. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Newbold.
Yes, I'd like to follow on with that actually about heritage assets. Can you identify the fact that there are some community assets that also equally should actually deserve the same respect as the heritage assets as well? And there are several of those in the borough as well.
For example?
Speckled wood. In addition to that, I am saddened by the fact that some of the reports that you're being asked to use are 2009 reports when Mr. Giles Coe, the Applied Ecology Group, has actually said to us that he felt that some of these reports should be updated, and they haven't been. And he's been trying to get some of these updated, I believe, recently, but it's all a bit too late for this whole process, which is a bit of a shame.
Thank you. I also just wanted to make a point in relation to the natural environment and the natural assets. Although these are looked at and the current discussion is very much based on their biodiversity value, we would also like to highlight the importance of the ecosystem services that they provide and the natural capital that will be needed by Hastings for sustainable development in the future. Obviously, we were unable to find any information within the evidence base that any assessment of the ecosystem services currently used or that would be required to meet this housing demand has been assessed. And we would very much like to see that within the evidence base so that it can be assessed whether the ecosystem services are can be achieved through the suggested allocations and to meet that housing number, whether other local planning authorities and other areas sustain some of their ecosystem services, so whether we're talking about carbon sequestration or flood alleviation or pollination or whichever one of those services it may be, whether they're used wholly within the boundaries of this borough council or whether other authorities are also using ecosystem services within this boundary of this borough.
Right. Yes, Mr. Wise.
There's 2 points I'd like to bring up, Mr. Hollicks. One, about this document I suppose to you.
That's your statement for matter 1, I think. Is that right? But I do recognise the point of it.
Right. The point is, I'm very, very concerned at the effect that all this will have on the Coomhaven Wild Countryside Park, because one, in the last 3 years we've lost all our native waterfalls because of the river stays flooded such a long time and overflows. We've also had a problem. We did have a lovely otter there that was killed on one of the paths by dogs because all the otter holts were completely wiped out. Now the SSI site in the Coomhaven Country Park, the more flooding that happens, the more it's going to be affected. This last year, because in my garden I had 3 feet of water that receded and all sorts of things, so it wasn't just groundwater from all these sites, you have all the area from Rotherham and another, in from the maps. It's got all sorts of pollutions in it. I lost all my chicken, and the thing is, forget about those sort of things. My concern is that nobody is putting proper thought to all these 25 building, whatever you call it, sites, development sites, which are going to affect the Coomhaven countryside park. I understand they want to build at St Leonard's infant school that was. Now, some of the ground behind that was made up, so it's no longer a floodplain. And at this minute, the Coomhaven caravan site people, in their wisdom, are raising all their banks, because last year they got flooded as well, because they had quite high banks and it went in and caused them a lot of problems, and unfortunately the council gave them permission to put these banks up, but on our side there is nothing. So as soon as already this year some of the local paths on the side of the river have been flooded, but it is a very serious issue that the council have not properly looked at or adjusted, or whatever you like to call it. So could the council please put these matters right, so that in future we don't get the floods, because it is possible. I gave you the letter the other day from the Environmental Agency, the copy that you've got. Now the next point I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to bring up is that at Speckled Wood, for example, or the Victoria Avenue Valley, all round there, Broom Grove site, the other site, they're building like heck, which is fair enough. All the wildlife are now concentrating in Speckled Wood. It's just absolutely full of wildlife. The council, in their wisdom, from the power station, for example, took 800 common lizards up to the country park. All of them perished because, in somebody's rather naive wisdom, didn't consider properly that animals have to be, if you want to translocate them, they've got to be put in as an environment same as they're already coming from. And since then, because I've written to Natural England, they've changed their guidelines, so I and everybody else must encompass an area in the development site, if there's going to be building houses, that our native reptiles and amphibians must be accommodated properly on site and not transported or chucked somewhere else.
So are you suggesting there should be a policy in the development management plan to...
Yes, if it isn't already there, it should be.
Right.
Okay. Because Natural England, you see, all I have to do is write to Natural England each time, oppose badger exclusions, and because there's nowhere for the badgers to go, for example, at Speckled Wood, absolutely nowhere, because they've all come there from all the other development areas round the site, and it's now absolutely chock-a-block with wildlife, which is good. I'm not saying it's bad, it's excellent, because the main important feature of Speckled Wood is that lovely little stream. You'll notice one day when you go out and see it. It's full of all sorts of interesting things, but the point is, that is one source of fresh water that wildlife have now, whereas
as I said, we will be looking at these sites.
Lots of places in Hastings, the little stream lines have been culverted in.
Right, okay. So, I mean, what I'm going to do, Mr. Wise, is to ask you to draft a policy ensuring the proper translocation of reptiles, insects, flora, fauna, that sort of thing. Could you do that for me,
I'll
please?
make you a draft, but they can't be translated. You can't translate them. Translocate them anywhere now. You have to stay on site. So I will draft you a policy, yes.
Thank you, yes, and if you could let me have that by the Programme Officer by the 5th of December, please. Right, well, I think right, yes, Mr. Collier, then I will come to the Council to respond to those points. Yes, Mr. Collier.
I'd just like to put a word in for the sea. I understand that we'll get, and there are written in various of these reports going years back, intention. There is an intention to do this and an intention to do that. In February 2007, Hastings Borough Council they were committed to explore the new European standards for bathing water in partnership with the Environment Agency and water authorities. They committed themselves to do that. In 2011, Mr. Borman, who was here today, he said he'd be horrified to see beaches carrying warning signs. In August 2011, the government analysed 51 beaches, finding that blighted by raw sewage from storm overflows, Bexhill-on-Sea and Hastings beaches were included in that list. So that's 2007 to 2011. The Marine Conservation Society in 2012 said, we're going to have to get to grips with this, because if we don't, some of these resorts are going to be closed down. All along, there have been commitments from Hastings Borough Council that something needs to be done. Councillor Chowney, Deputy Leader of the Council, he wrote that the current issue with seawater quality was not to do with the quality deteriorating, rather it was to do with the standards changing. Time goes by. In March of 2013, Rachel Wyatt, who's the Coast Pollution Officer for the Marine Conservation Society, said that the St Leonard's rating is downgraded because of a higher level of bacteria. So we're now in 6 years, 5-6 years go by, and things are not getting better. Despite commitments to investigate this, they're actually getting worse. And on the 16th of March 2014, under the heading, Kiss Me Quick Before 45 Top Beaches Close, we find that Hastings is still as bad or worse than it has ever been. And the Council's response to that, rather than getting to the core problem, which is the overflow of sewers, which I think has been touched on in the housing discussion, the answer is that the Council are considering moving the bathing area to a new location. So rather than tackle the problem, they're going to move the bathing area.
To Eastbourne.
A
Yes.
few yards up the road.
Eastbourne.
That's the solution.
My point made.
Thank you.
Can I just say something on that? I have noticed up in Orr that we have had the EA working on a lot of the issues of drainage and where pollutants are getting into the stream in Speckled Wood, and this has improved the area dramatically. And I think there has been, certainly in Orr, some work on this to try and do something. I'm not sure on the rest of the borough, but certainly some of it has happened up in Orr.
Right, I'm now going to, yes, Orr Community Land Trust.
Just a quick one to come back on something that you mentioned about connectivity, and particularly green connectivity, green corridors. That's very much one of our key projects in the Orr Valley, because there is a big problem with connectivity or lack of it, and we're working on the Orr Valley Greenway project, which is a part of the Hastings Greenway network, which in itself is within the plan as a sort of cycle route sort of network for the whole of Hastings. So this is a part of that, and I think that's very, very important about having connectivity and connections and access. But actually, what I really wanted to say was looking at policy HN8. I think the thing that's a bit weak about it is it talks about mitigation to avoid damage from new developments, but what it should say, in addition, I believe, is it should say new development should be used to enhance and improve infrastructure and connectivity around them. And of course, by that I mean that there should be a very robust approach using Section 106 funding for infrastructure improvement work, which fits in with protection of green space and open space and also connectivity. I think it should be beefed up with something stronger. Rather than just mitigating against damage, it should talk about using development for positive improvement.
So I've got policy HN8 in front of me. So we're looking at, is it one of the bullet points at the bottom? Is that the one?
Well, it's a lack of a bullet point, really.
Sorry?
It's a lack of a bullet point.
Oh, I see, right.
Yeah.
So
I mean, the little 2, if I've got the right copy here, says adverse impacts can be satisfactorily minimised through mitigation. I would like to see something which says that developments can be used to improve infrastructure, and that is what Section 106 funding is supposed to be about. So I think that would be a helpful addition.
right, I made a note of that. Yes, thank you. Right, well, I'm going to...
Mr. Hullox,
So,
just to, I mean, I was kept quiet so far, but just to reiterate that the bullet points in that policy, I'm quite sure you're quite aware that it does actually say opportunities for connectivity between spaces, improved accessibility to them, green space and biodiversity improvements on and off site as appropriate, which would obviously be guaranteed through Section 106 agreements, opportunities for the retention and creation of green infrastructure, and measures for the protection and management of ecology where appropriate. I can't help feeling that Mr. Sears' points are actually covered in the policy.
Shall I come back on that?
Yes, sir.
I mean, that's a start, but I don't think it's quite strong enough. It needs an actual number to say that developments will be, or developers will be required to look at these figures. But I appreciate that some of the wordings there, I just don't think it's strong enough.
Okay, thank you. So, Council, would you like to respond? It's quite a number.
I would love to, sir. But before we move off that very last point, and as the gentleman in question is sitting immediately to the left of Mr. Sear, I would just like to ask Mr. Hollige's comment about Section 106 contributions, bearing in mind what we've heard from him over the last 2 days about developments and viability.
Yes, I'm quite happy to comment on Section 106 contributions. It is anything particularly wanted to...
For green infrastructure, for exactly what Mr. Sear was asking.
Well, the difficulty of Section 106 contributions, and it also applies to the community infrastructure levies, that more so with the latter now, that they have to be in relation to the impact of that development. And they're very carefully scrutinised, and if they fail those tests of reasonableness, then they can be discounted.
But providing that individuals, for example, such as Mr. Sear or Mrs. Stevenson put forward that case, that would be a legitimate cause for paying those contributions.
Well, that would be to the... I suppose there's 2 issues. Is one, whether the developer signs up to that. If they don't sign up to it and make an appeal, then it'd be for the planning inspector to decide whether those requests for Section 106 contributions are legally sound.
Yeah, can I just help on that? Well, thank you, Mr. Hollis. That's very useful. The planning framework, the NPPF, paragraph 204, it says planning obligations should only be sought where they meet all of the following tests. First, necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms. Secondly, directly related to the development, which was your point, and fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind to the development. So as you say, there are very strict tests governing these obligations. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say that, yes, you can't just impose whatever you think you'd like.
No. Right.
Thanks, Phil. The question really was more about the management of expectations, because there are two sides to every story, and I think that response from Mr. Hollidge, your quote from the framework, and the concerns of others around the table need to be balanced in that overall equation. If I may, sir, I'm going to try to go through all of the questions that were raised. There's the best part of 30 of them. There will be a couple that I will offer and pass to my colleagues, but I'll do my best to run through them and respond to the issues that were raised. I think the first one was raised by Dr. Joyce, and fully accept the concerns that we have heard on previous days of this hearing, that sometimes the practice of what is developed doesn't live up to the wording of the policies. Neither the inspector or myself is in a position to undo permissions that have been granted or delivered, if you like, but I'm perfectly happy, maybe during the coffee break, to share with you the document which is the adopted planning strategy, and to point you to those additional policies which are now embodied in that, and which 3 at least in the main had come from the inspector's recommendations following the examination of that strategy. That was the first point. Mrs. Stevenson raised the point about, it was in a generic sense, but she used RobSAC as an example, sir, in terms of mystery changes to maps. Now, I think in fairness, when we deal with Matter 5, you had asked earlier, sir, I think in these areas, if we might be able to bring some large-scale maps to show, and we're perfectly happy to do that in terms of the map showing the ancient woodland and the local nature reserve designations. One point that I would like to make, sir, is that obviously times do move on, and although 1 or 2 people might have expressed concerns about it, the cyclical nature of planning means that in the future, Hastings as a borough will be required to provide yet more growth, yet more housing. I just wanted to point out, sir, that in actual fact, in respect of the site that Mrs. Stevenson is concerned about, this is in the 93 plan, a much greater area of what was then probably more legitimately meadow, known as RobSAC Meadow.
Well, that was our name for it.
Yes, what was actually allocated for housing development. And although it isn't surprising in planning terms, it is somewhat ironic that those who are now most vehemently against the extension of that actually reside in those homes that were provided through that plan. I think similarly, sir, in respect of the site that particularly concerns Mr. Newbold, the Speckled Wood site as called. In the 2004 plan, a greater area of that was shown for residential development than is in the plan before examination now, and indeed it wasn't designated as a local wildlife site. So things move and they change both ways, both in terms of development pressures requiring more in some circumstances, and in terms of new information leading to new designations in some situations. Equally, as Mr. Murray Davidson, I'm sure, will point out later on, ecology generally doesn't stand still. It requires to be managed. Some sites will depreciate in terms of their interest. Others, with positive management, as Mr. Sear has alluded to, can be enhanced, not just in terms of their biodiversity interest, but also for their community benefit. I think the reference made by Mr. Newbold to the Habitats Directive, realistically, and with all due respect to the site that he is very passionate about, the Habitats Directive relates to sites that are designated for their European significance, so wouldn't, of course, apply to the site that you're concerned about. We mentioned that we had gone through an appropriate assessment, sir, of the plan in respect of meeting the Habitats regulations and the Habitats Directive. Mr. Hollidge referred to the adequacy of ecology investigations and correspondence that he'd had from Mr. Cookson. I have previously advised and reminded him that in 2009, he made an inquiry of our development control people to ask about the suitability of his client's land as a development site, and he was advised then that it was within a site of nature conservation importance. In that respect, whilst I'm aware, he has more recently, very much more recently, through his Freedom of Information request, asked what the SNCI process was. He was made aware of it as far back as 2009. He asked, I think, as well, why we hadn't engaged Mr. White, the local wildlife expert. I can't comment on whether you were available or what your rates were at that stage, sir, but all I can say is that as part of that survey, I understand it was a gentleman by the name of Andrew Grace from the Hastings Wildlife Group who was
yeah, they've just failed. They failed a long time ago. As Mr. Davis.
Yes, let Mr. Phillips respond.
It was only in response to who was the local wildlife person. There were, I've already mentioned that Dr. Alex Tate, who was the county ecologist, was used, and Dr. Tony Whitbread, who I think is your chief executive at the moment, isn't he? Yeah. Okay. Mr. Sear, I think, very sensibly raised the point about the community benefit as well as the wildlife benefit of some of these. We look forward to receiving and hopefully being able to comment favourably upon the strengthening of text that you have asked him to provide in terms of his homework. The Trust has made it quite clear in their representation that whilst they would prefer no development in the area, they do see this as a possible way forward, and my understanding is that there are no public footpaths that currently cross the site. We heard that much of it is in private ownership. Baliani yesterday alluded to the fact that he had brought together a considerably fragmented ownership situation into his ownership since, I think, early 2000. Mr. Wise made a comment that I think was suggesting we're not democratically elected. I certainly would not wish to ever go to that sort of esteemed level, but I can provide you, sir, if you need, with the Cabinet and the full Council resolutions which have submitted this plan to you, and it is that body that is a democratically elected body.
No, but you're not.
I don't think I've disagreed with you, sir. Okay.
Yes, I think, may I have a copy of those resolutions? Yes.
Indeed.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Ms. Teresa Jarvis raised a concern regarding the convent site as it's colloquially referred to, and if and maybe we can either deal with that in the more distinct matters, or once I've run through this list, I'll ask Ms. Murphy to comment on your concerns about that, and I think your suggestion in particular of the grounds, and in particular what are sort of playing fields to the north of the convent at the moment. The point that I made this morning to Mr. McGinley was that whilst I think a number of people are perhaps understandably concerned with an as yet undetermined application, the policy does not seek to allocate. The policy is recognising the importance of seeking to do what may be necessary to help preserve the fabric of the built heritage.
No, please.
Sorry.
Yeah. Sussex Wildlife Trust obviously, understandably, has raised a number of concerns because of the proximity, or in some cases adjacent, and in one or two cases within. I would just wish, if I may, sir, to talk to the National Planning Policy Framework, which we have discussed on many occasions now, and how your task, sir, is to see whether the plan is sound when looked at the NPPF as a whole. We referred yesterday in some significant detail to the requirements of that framework in encouraging, exhorting us to meet as far as we can our full objectively assessed housing needs. You won't be aware that the gentleman on your right, instead of looking to provide some 3,400 houses within the borough over the plan period, was suggesting we should be doubling that to 6,800. If you look at our proposals plan, the nature of Hastings, which was described and has been described by many quite correctly as unique, historic, with 7 hills, there are very limited opportunities for finding the 3,400 homes, let alone the 6,800, without being close to or adjacent to sites that are designated. Paragraph 110 of the framework advises that in preparing plans to meet development needs, the aim should be to minimise pollution and other adverse effects on the local and natural environment. Plans should allocate with the least environmental or amenity value where consistent with other policies in this framework. That, sir, I would submit is exactly what the Council has endeavoured to do in this situation. Paragraph 111 then goes on to suggest that planning policies and decisions should encourage the effective use of land by reusing land that has been previously developed, commonly referred to as brownfield land. You heard from Kerry Colbert on behalf of the Planning Authority yesterday, sir, that over 75% of our allocations are on previously developed land. Paragraph 113 of that framework then goes on to say that local authorities should set criteria-based policies against which proposals for any development on or affecting protected wildlife sites will be judged. Mr. Davidson, I think, couldn't help himself there, so I'm jumping in and saying that is precisely what that particular policy is looking to do, subject to serious comment that, perhaps that could be strong. It also indicates that plans should make distinctions between the hierarchy of international, national and locally designated sites so that protection is commensurate with their status and appropriate weight can be given to their importance, to the contribution that they make. So I think in that sense, whilst I fully appreciate the role that the Trust has, we do feel that in the round and taking on all of the responsibilities and duties of the framework, that we have come up with an appropriate plan that is justified, is effective and is compliant with that framework. There was a reference again, I think, from Mrs. Jarvis to the commitment previously made, she said, to buildings of merit as previously identified in the Antrim work, being added to the list of non-designated heritage assets. Now, at the end of our submission on this matter, sir, as an appendix to it, you will see the work that the Borough Council is endeavouring to do in promoting a local list, sir, and the guidance notes. And I'm sure that the Council would be happy to take Mrs. Jarvis's idea forward. But obviously the guidance notes are there. There are guidance notes that are prepared really using the English Heritage Guidance as templates, and whether or not those buildings in total or individually meet that guidance, I cannot say at this point, sir. But obviously that is something that can be considered. Mr. Newbold then referred to an ASBO ruling. I'm not certain if it is a ruling or new legislation that may be coming out, but obviously we wait to hear what that is. And
it is a ruling.
And we can hear what...
Sorry, it is a ruling.
We can hear what... We heard yesterday, though, sir, from Mr. Valiami of his different views on the knotweed, and indeed also heard other similar views from Mr. Kerrison as the Council's viability consultant. You responded, I think, sir, and I need no saying no more, to Teresa Jarvis's suggestion of looking basically to extend the conservation area, and obviously you advised there were set procedures to go through on that. It's not just something that happens automatically. Whether or not the Council considers it to be so has to go through a process. I'm aware again from Mr. McGinley's comments, and he referred to paragraph 109 of the framework, that he obviously has got significant concern about some of the planning decisions that the Council has made in the past. There are people in this audience that are listening to that, and I can certainly feed back, if you haven't already, I'm sure, through letters and whatever else, to those people, the case officers and those members that sit on the planning committees. The one thing that I would say in terms of experience, if the local authority is minded to refuse, then they would generally, I would suggest, welcome full support at appeal if it goes to appeal. And I know that, I think in the case of your society, sir, that has recently happened and hopefully did lead to maybe not the perfect outcome, but a better one than you initially feared. Mr. Newbold then referred to sequential testing, and again, sir, I did indicate that is really in respect of flooding and Environment Agency rather than matters that are more core to today's or this afternoon's discussion. Sussex Wildlife Trust came back again in terms of looking to make a suggestion that we should revisit the Green Infrastructure Strategy of 2012. My concerns with all of this, and at the pre-hearing meeting, I think you did advise all of those people that had a concern for the future of Hastings and a concern for the lack of quality of some of the schemes that you feel have been delivered, that the most successful way of looking to protect that is to have a plan-led approach, to have a current plan. Whilst you have concerns about some of the decisions, that does not make either the plan unsound or the policies within it unsound. It is the interpretation and the application of those that you seem to have concerns with. And Mrs. Stevenson added to that the lack of enforcement and follow-up on some of the conditions. That is not anything that this document can address. It's something that needs to be addressed at the time and after the permission is granted. Mr. Ingleton referenced various heritage assets policies and was expressing concern in respect of applications along the ridge, and again whether or not that is something that you will obviously be aware of from site visits. There are a number of site applications along there, and it may be that again there are examples that you wish to point to. Mrs. Pamela Brown was talking about the protection of open space and her concerns about that. And she expressed some concern about West Hill and the possible threat of some of it being fenced. Now, obviously, the erection of fencing generally is not something that's going to require permission, and that is within the remit of the landowner, I suppose. But again, I think in terms of an open space and a green infrastructure policy, the council has endeavoured, where it is possible, to say what is there as designated green space. It is in many of our policies for site allocations looking to enhance the provision either of that element or indeed of the biodiversity enhancement elements that Mr. Murray Davidson referred to. Dr. Joyce referred to his feeling that there should be a more integrated approach within the Borough Council to the built and the natural heritage. He referred to the fact that his society had a borough-wide approach rather than a more localised to St Leonard's. And again, I am aware from the previous content that we worked with the Borough Council in terms of the appeal process, and again would suggest that they would, I'm sure, be more willing to work with you with some of your concerns about what you perceive as a lack of an integrated approach. You referred to the, I think you call it an abject condition in terms of the two promenaded areas. Again, something that is quite difficult for a local authority to deal with. Potentially there are powers available at their discretion, Section 215 notices being the main thing. They can, as in many of the powers that the government says local authorities have, prove to be inordinately expensive to initiate and indeed to enforce. And even the cost to a local authority of a fairly minor appeal is significant, particularly in the current sort of straitened budgetary situations that all local authorities are in. But again, close working with societies such as yourselves, I'm sure is something that the authority would be more than happy to listen to. In that respect, again, Mr. Hollocks has set you homework as well, sir, in terms of policies, and we look forward to commenting on the proposed wording of those when we receive them through the programme officer. There is reference again to the need, and it's referenced in the guidance notes, to management plans for each of the conservation areas. I think perhaps in common with very many local authorities, some of their conservation areas have not had recent management plans. Again, a matter of priorities and resources. And I think that the local authority has been in particular focusing its efforts in recent years on getting a planning strategy through the process, and now this document. My understanding is that following the passage of this, however that passage now moves, there is within an indicative programme for the development control, development management people, the prospect of looking to see if that work can be programmed in. Now, you obviously have a number of conservation areas, and I'm sure each and every one of you would wish to say yours is top of the list, but obviously that again is something that is being looked at. Mr Newbold made a mention of the recent work done by Mr Giles Coe, who is an ecology consultant employed by the council. I think, sir, in fairness, and I've seen some of the reps, but Mr Coe will be present for the day that we deal with Speckled Wood. I think some of the comments that's been made are, shall we say, rather inaccurate or wide of the mark. Some of the comments even that I've seen attributed to Mr Coe, I'm confident he would wish to comment upon. So just as Mr Shaw commented today, yes, I think Mr Coe will be happy to respond to Mr Newbold on that day. I think that the Sussex Wildlife Trust was basically talking about ecosystem services and their value. No assessment of these had been made. I think with respect, we have looked at what can be delivered in terms of green networks, green infrastructure strategy, and indeed in terms of green space. The one thing that I wish to say here is that whilst there was a suggestion, I think, that be achieved through development, we have heard previously at these hearings that the development industry generally is not prepared to wait for the gestation of local plan periods before it sticks in applications, and the local planning authority has an obligation to deal with those. Now, whether there is ever any situation where you could get all developers who are clamouring to build, and we've heard from a number of developers that they want their land included, to all wait for the same period of time to get that work done, I would suggest is not really a practical suggestion or the way that the development industry works, unfortunately. Mr Wise basically, I think, referred or almost resubmitted his matter one statement in terms of the effect of surface water. He alluded again, sir, to the fact that we had not addressed those concerns. I had previously responded to Mr Wise by saying that all of the plan had gone through sequential testing, flood risk, results that had been validated and endorsed by the Environment Agency, and also we had a debate, sir, in respect of southern water and connections to infrastructure, where again I think there was a divergence of views between Mr Wise, who felt that the connection and the capacity should be there before any permission was given, and between Mr Holly, who felt that that sort of thing could be sorted out at condition stage on a permission granted. Mr Wise has also a little bit of homework in terms of the translocation of species. I don't know whether that's particularly going to relate to herpetiles or it is going to refer to entomological or other species or not, but again, look forward to receiving that text and being able to comment upon it. Mr Collier made a number of comments then about the quality of seawater and the Marine Conservation Society. Again, perfectly valid, and following on from this morning's discussion about tourism, again, particularly important for the Borough Council. I think what he forgot from his discussions was that Hastings Borough Council cannot of itself clean up the sea. There are significant obligations and indeed duties upon the Environment Agency and Southern Water in respect of that. My understanding is that the Environment Agency is responsible for giving discharge consents to Southern Water. It is their responsibility to ensure that those discharge consents are not exceeded, and indeed, if Southern Water exceed those discharge consents, it is then potentially the responsibility of the Environment Agency to initiate prosecutions. I am aware, however, that Mr Davidson will also wish to comment further about the work that the Council is doing to ensure that the quality of the bathing and the seawater in Hastings is kept high. Mr Newbold, I think then came up with a very positive indication that the Environment Agency working in the Upper Orr area had meant that the environment generally was improving, which was helpful, and I think also underscores my comment that the Council cannot deliver all of what you want on its own. We've heard a lot about infrastructure providers, and in this particular instance, coming back to Mr Collier's concerns about seawater quality, I would again maintain that the Environment Agency and Southern Water has got to work with us in order to do what we feel is appropriate, and I think what you concluded, sir, was indeed part of the lifeblood of Hastings, which was tourism, part of which is coming to the seaside. Mr. Sear talked about connectivity, and we, I think, dealt with that at the time, sir, when I asked about the one of 6 contributions and how that would be balanced. And Mr. Davidson also then came in to point out that he felt that the policy did actually already incorporate what Mr. Sear was asking for. So that's probably more than enough from me, sir, but if I can maybe just ask firstly Mr. Murray Davidson to add any information on the sea quality and the marine, and then come back to Emma Murphy if there are any other comments on the built heritage that she wants to add to.
Actually, I mean, we have been going for 1 3/4 hours. I think now is the time to have a cup of tea, and I think in particular you So I will adjourn until 5 to 4 at that clock.
Yeah, I've got that. Can we respond before we go on? Because there's a lot of information that's been put over there. Okay, thank you.
One point that Dave Phillips didn't address regarding including 6. No, wait a minute.
Did you say numbers 6 to 8?
6 to 8 Ellerslie Road.
Erroneously.
Well, they are listed as part of the conservation area on HBC's website, and they're not included on the map.
We'll certainly look at that, so if it is an error, they will be included on that.
Okay, fine, that's perfect.
I know Mr. Newbold is if you get back into if you recall, sir, Mr. Davidson was going to respond to Mr. Collins.
Yes, that's right, yes. I just wanted to make an announcement about our programme. I mean, it's now coming up for 4 o'clock. I do want to have a full discussion on policy HN6, and I think it's highly unlikely that we'll be able to do that this afternoon because we've obviously not finished on the first question. So I will be in contact with the programme officer to set a separate date for our consideration of policy HN6. And what I would like to do in the meantime, I want to have another look at this policy. I'd like to suggest some redrafting of part of it, and if I have that, or if we can have that available for when we come back to look at that policy, I think it would be that would probably be the best way of doing it. So I think we will spend the rest of this afternoon dealing with the first question on our agenda this afternoon.
Can I just say that's very welcome?
Oh yes, thank you. Good. Yes, I mean I think it's obviously very important that everybody has a fair hearing, and I certainly don't want to rush things, just to meet our 5 o'clock deadline, which I want to meet in any case. So yes,
Mr. Hollis.
Yes.
Mr. Hollis, just very briefly, I've been with Hastings Borough Council 20 years now. As Mr. Wise indicated, I started as an ecologist with Hastings Borough Council. Whilst I'm not of the sort of wise old years that Mr. Wise is, I'm now the service manager for the Parks Department. My experience relates to, I'm the vice chair of the Association of Local Government Ecologists, and I'm on the all-party parliamentary group for biodiversity, so we influence government policy, including national planning policy frameworks, etc., on biodiversity for government. I'm also a co-author of Biodiversity Code of Practice for Planning and Development, which I'll come on to in relation to policy HN8, Biodiversity in Green Space, which is particularly relevant for. It's a new code of practice, a new British standard, which just came out last year. Obviously, the Sussex Wildlife Trust have eloquently indicated just how difficult it is to balance green space and development. And that has been one of our overriding issues in developing the new development management plan. Obviously, when we produced, and I won't go over it because you indicated right at the beginning, Mr. Horrocks, the planning strategy has already been obviously adopted. And in the planning strategy, we are obviously trying to square that circle between green infrastructure, ecosystem services, and the protection of the natural environment on a strategic sense, with the development that is required as part of our development, economic development and housing allocations. I think the green infrastructure and ecosystem services issues is quite adequately dealt with within the natural environment chapter of the strategy. And as you indicated, you had also indicated that we've strengthened our policies for ancient woodland, local nature reserves, sites of nature conservation programs. So I won't dwell on that. However, I do think it indicates that we have taken into consideration the Sussex Wildlife Trust's legitimate concerns relating to development and protection of green space. Obviously, when we're looking at the development management plan, we are looking at how we can accommodate development and how we can protect the natural environment. And those are balancing acts that we have to consider in great detail. We have to obviously relate the development management plan policies to policies in the National Planning Policy Framework. So chapter section 118 is particularly relevant, and in some respects we have mirrored section 118 in our development management plan, and I would draw your attention to 4.32 and 118, where we are seeking to avoid harm to biodiversity, mitigate against unavoidable damage, or at a last resort compensate for unavoidable damage. That is completely consistent with paragraph 118 of NPPF. What we have sought to do with policy HM8 in particular is we have taken the biodiversity, the new British standard, which identifies a consistent approach to development and protecting the natural environment. And we have applied a need for what we've called an ecological constraints and opportunities plan prior to any development or to be submitted with an application. What that does is it means that we as a local authority, in conjunction with, and I'll draw your attention to circular 2005, where the legal imperative is set out for local authorities and protected species, etc., where the onus is on the developer to provide sufficient information for the local authority to make an informed decision. And so, therefore, in providing as much information up front, the local authority is seeking to get as much information to make that informed decision. So the Ecological Constraints and Opportunities Plan allows us to understand just how protected species may be affected, how sites of nature conservation may be affected, how sites of special scientific interest may be affected, connectivity, sustainable urban drainage, etc. And so that we can build a picture and we can seek additional information if we don't feel that sufficient information has been provided that not only complies with our overall strategy, but with the development management plan policy.
Could I just have the reference to that circular?
Yes,
I missed that.
Yes, so circular.
I got the 2005.
Yeah. It's Government Circular Biodiversity and Geological Conservation Statutory Obligations and their Impact within the Planning System. It's ODPM Circular 06205 or DEFRA Circular 01205.
Thank you.
Also, in considering any planning application, which I think that the development management plan is there to set a framework against. When we're considering planning applications, we also will consider all government advice, like NPPF, our proposed policies in our development management plan, but also standing advice, natural and standing advice. They provide a series of standing advice notes on ancient woodlands, reptiles, badgers, great crested newts, etc. And we as a local authority will consider those because these are material considerations in any planning application. We will expect all developers to adhere to the new British standard. And so I'd just like to conclude by reiterating that the Council, as far as the Development Management Plan, the policies in the Development Management Plan and the consideration of planning applications, it adheres to current government policies, national policies, British standards and government circulars. And I think we're one of the leading local authorities in relation to protecting our natural green space. One of the issues that has come up is obviously relates to bathing water, and I can only give you a slight overview of this in that the Bathing Water Quality Directive, standards will change next year. We will have a more stringent criteria in order to adhere to. So one of the things we've been doing is working very closely with the Environment Agency, and we're not just committed to, we're actually implementing. We're working with the Environment Agency and Southern Water to look at misconnections, and the Southern Water and the Environment Agency are actively investigating misconnections in the centre of town. Misconnections means that houses plumb up their sewage systems to the surface water system, and that tends to, in a place like Hastings, actually go into Alexandra Park. Once it goes into Alexandra Park, it goes out to the sea, and therefore that is where the Environment Agency take their readings. So the Council has been working very closely with these agencies to alleviate these misconnections. It's not something that we will ever complete because new houses come on stream, and obviously DIY projects sometimes misconnect things, so it's something that will be ongoing. However, within Alexandra Park itself, over the last year, we've implemented, which is owned by Hastings Borough Council, we've invested quite heavily with the Environment Agency to improve the water quality that is coming through Alexandra Park as well. We're reprofiling some of the catchment ponds. We're planting up some of the areas in order to contain some of the bacteria and also to increase the amount of sunlight that gets into some of the ponds. So we're actively seeking to implement a lot of improvements within Alexandra Park that will mitigate some of the negative results down at the beach. Early indications are that the bathing water quality is improving, and we would hope to continue that improvement in years to come. It wasn't the Council, by the way, Mr. Hawkes, that changed the position of the bathing water testing site. It was the Environment Agency. So if anyone wants to feel they need a further explanation as to why the Environment Agency did that, I'm quite happy to give you an Environment Agency contact for anyone to get in touch with them to seek further clarification with that. But it wasn't a Hastings Borough Council decision to do that. We're just working with them to improve the water quality in Alexandra Park. And if you've been to Alexandra Park recently, you'll have seen that there's in-water planting, there's new planting, there's new profiling of some of the catchment ponds, and we'll be continuing to work with that to improve the water quality because it's such an important aspect of the town. We do not want to fail our bathing water quality. So I think I've given you an overview of why I think the development management plan policy is sound. I don't, obviously, if Mr. Sears or Mr. Wise wants to come forward, or indeed the Wildlife Trust wants to come forward with any suggestions as to how we can make this stronger, more relevant to British standard or to NPPF, we're quite happy to look at it.
Yes, I mean, I think we always have to remember that the development management plan is part of the development plan for the borough. The planning strategy and the development management plan go together, and they form the basis in the determination of any planning application. Also, of course, taking into account any material considerations such as the National Planning Policy Framework. So really, the local plan, with its two parts, is the basis on which we move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Howes. I've got nothing further to add unless there's any particular questions on the policy. I'm quite happy to deal with site-based issues at another time.
Yes.
I'm quite happy to deal with the policy as it stands just now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Holdridge.
Just listening to what Mr. Davison said, I noticed he failed to answer my questions earlier. Will you be attending all the sessions of the focus areas, or is this for only attendance?
Sorry?
Is this your only attendance before the examinations? Because I do have a number of questions for you.
Mr. Hawks, I'll be here for the day that we were discussing Speckled Wood and the day we're discussing Gropsack.
And what about Barley Lane?
Well, they come under focus area 12.
Oh, yes,
it's
of
the
course.
same
day, sir.
Yes, sorry, yes. Yes, so you'll be there. Yes, thank you.
I mean, the questions I'd asked, which you didn't ask, was what type of survey you'd carried out on my client's land and under whose instruction. I don't know if you can answer that now.
Can we leave that?
Okay, we'll leave it to the focus area. Okay, the points I want to just come back to on what Mr. Phillips was saying in his response. It seems to be under some misconception as to what I was saying about housing numbers. What I've said on this issue is that the planning strategy is flawed in the sense that following the Court of Appeal case and the St Albans case, that the housing need figures need to be objectively assessed and cannot be constrained. I'm not advocating the delivery of 6,800 homes. I'm advocating that the planning strategy correctly identifies the housing need, and then each site will consider when plan applications come forward. So just to correct that misconception, I'm not advocating that, and I'm sure he knows that. And now I'd just like to go back, and he keeps raising this letter about Mr. Cookson, and I've responded to that. It's in my submission, and I've pointed out that Mr. Cookson responded in relation to a site that wasn't my client's land. It was another site altogether, and there was a question as to whether that was misleading to the 2004 public examination of the adopted plan at that time.
Yes, Mr. Newell.
Yes, I'd like to respond to Mr. Phillips first. Thank you very much for giving the information on the Habitats Directory. That wasn't actually the report I was talking about. The report I was talking about was the review of local wildlife sites, which is 2009, and was in view of Mr. Giles Coe that basically, as we've said, he's indicated that this needs some substantial updating. And it was his intention to update this regularly, and this hasn't happened. This is one of the things that we would like to see happen, and this is very important because if you are going to be building on some of these sites, you desperately need to know what's actually here.
Can I just have a reference number?
Yeah, that's HBC DMP 65.
Thank you.
In relation to the footpaths in Speckled Wood, there is historical information available about the Hastings Development Management Plan, which sets out the fact that this was an open space in 1930. This is in my evidence. It's evidence. Page.
I know which.
Oh no. Okay. It clearly shows there has been easements across the land since 1930. The fact that no registered footpaths has actually happened is because the process for actually registering footpaths is extremely complicated. You will find that on most maps now, and including OS, they do show wet footpaths across the land which have been put in by different groups along the way to try and push the people that, or many people that use the site into specific paths. This has worked very well, and as part of the fact that we welcome the Mr. Phillips said that he likes things plan-led, I can tell him that we actually have a management plan for the area. It was put before the 2012 Cabinet. We have been working with the council and with all the other resources to try and implement this. It's very difficult because there is extreme problems on the site. Mr. Viliami, in my opinion, has never been on the site. There is information in hard copy available about Japanese knotweed on the site which is unrefuted. This is one of the council's own documents. This can't be refuted, and I don't understand why he would say there isn't a mass of knotweed on the site. There is. To go on, the sequential testing, my point wasn't about the fact that it was flooding. I haven't seen anything in this plan that actually is a test against all of the actual assets to show how this allocations have been chosen. That was my point I was trying to make. I'm sorry that you misunderstood the fact that it was coming out of policy or something else. That wasn't my intention. My intention was to find out how these sites of allocations were being picked on an individual basis. I welcome Mr. Jarko's comments on my letter. There is 3 groups involved with a consultation that he was supposed to be doing, which hasn't actually been brought into this meeting so far. In regard Mr. Davison's, that's very interesting information about the fact that you are looking at SCNIs and SCCIs. I think we've already heard today that 8 of them have been redesignated and lost. What really concerns me is that you said nothing about sites which have been designated incorrectly or have not even been designated. There's nothing in what you said that would actually say to me that basically you've looked at somewhere like Speckled Wood, which has no designation at the moment, which clearly should have, and that is quite concerning to me because have a way forward, you've got to be looking at not only the SNCI sites, you've got to be looking at all sites on an individual basis, as the inspector has suggested.
One of the things I should be asking you when we come to look at these sites at Speckled Wood is the status of any footpaths. I mean, are they, for example, on the definitive map?
They are on the definitive OS map, yes.
As a registered
public footpath. So I'm quite happy to bring out a copy of the definitive map with this one.
I think.
Could you bring it along to the session where we
Can you make sure that that map is the 1 to 10,000 scale map then, please? And it is the most current map, because we have a letter already from OS stating that we have the latest copy of the OS map, which we've already sent to the inspector, and we've agreed that we would provide the inspector when he comes to do the site visit.
Right, yes, I do want to be sure of the status of any footpaths.
Okay, as I have said, there has been a lack of registration of these proper footpaths. These easements have been on the site since 1930. There has been a real lack in the local authority dealing with this, and the process for it is extremely difficult.
Well, tell me what the status is.
The current status...
No, when we come to deal with the land. Yes. Yes, Sussex Wildlife Trust.
I just want to say thank you for answering our points in relation to the points we raised. I am slightly disappointed there's not more of a progressive view on the GI strategy as suggested, even though we recognise that you have carried that out. I guess we would still have concerns and welcome the removal of the actual sites that are allocated on sites designated for their biodiversity value, because at the moment it offers obvious severance for some of the GI network. But we do recognise and appreciate your comments about the need for there to be a plan in place. We'd like to see a way forward, and this may be achieved through probably more integration of the GI strategy and perhaps the strengthening of the wording of HN7 policy to reflect some of the more wording in relation to EN2 policy and the planning strategy. So perhaps there's some strengthening there that could be put in terms of making specific reference to Hastings Borough's own GI network.
That's policy HN7.
HN7, yeah,
And you're
potential
looking for
strengthening.
some-
Okay, yeah, we're happy to do that homework. And although I recognise that you made comments in terms of developers not being willing to wait for there to be an eco-services system assessment potentially of your plan and the needs of your borough to ensure sustainable development, if you are truly a leading authority in sort of the biodiversity value and those biodiversity sites, then perhaps it's something that a way forward would be to look at an SPD in terms of ecosystem services and the deliverability of that, whether there would be some potential for policy wording to suggest that that is looked at in future individual applications would be something, but we would encourage an SPD, I think, on ecosystem services.
Is that perhaps something that could go into the text above or below the policy?
Yes, potentially. I suppose that could fit into part. I suppose that could also be integrated in HN7. So yeah, that would be a way we would like to see potentially something on ecosystem services on that. So yeah, both of those points, strengthening of the policy in terms of bringing it in with the planning strategy and yes, an ecosystem services approach in the future.
Right. Yes, Mr. Jarvis.
It was with regard of the convent as private open space. Did you also want to leave that?
Yes, I would like to deal with it. The whole
that is
policy,
fine.
HN6. Yes.
And private open space.
Over
the northern part of the convent grounds.
Yeah, I think anything to do with the convent,
yeah.
we could leave that.
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, right, thank you. Right, yes, Mrs. Stevenson.
Thank you. Mr. Phillips, can I go back to the very, very beginning of your statement where you mentioned something about the rucksack area at the very beginning? You quoted something about people who live up there must remember that it was once not built on or something. Can you have a look at what you said?
Yes.
Because I'm lost to know what that's supposed to imply.
Right. I'm referring to the 1993 plan, the Borough Plan of 1993, so not going back quite as far as Mr. Newbold's with his Borough Plan. And in respect of the Rodsack area, which is here, there was a much larger area allocated for residential development.
Right.
Some of which is now built out.
Right.
I think from some of the photographs I've seen, including I think some that might have come through from yourself, it was more meadow, much more meadow-like earlier. I'm just making the point that it was a larger allocation, and whilst not unsurprising in a planning sense, some of the more vehement objection to the much smaller allocation that is now in this DMP is actually from those people who are living in some of those properties that were built as part of that allocation.
I will come in there. We had a 210 petition which did not come just from that area. And what I want to raise is this very important bit, because I wasn't very happy with the implication of your statement there. It was like people up there are people that shouldn't be complaining because they're living up there. Mr. Davison in his report actually said that the site we're talking about was the last piece of greenfield site left after a development which has literally encompassed the whole of the woodlands. And he said that that should not happen again because there was so little green fields piece left in the middle. And in fact, on this applied ecology report, they have reported, 2008/9, about Churchwood and Rudsack, saying that it's fragile because the site is subject to excessive human disturbance. Now, I moved there in 2006, and when I heard how that development had arisen, I was horrified. So I don't think it's fair for you to say, to my way it came across, you live up there, you should shut up because you can't complain. I complain bitterly. I am mortified that I bought a house in that sort of location when I heard from various workmen and what have you, what actually was there before. And the people who live there now, they're not bothered about the site. If you're thinking they're NIMBYs, it's got nothing to do with it. I live a long way from that site. But the little site there must be left alone. And even Mr. Davison's report says this is the last piece of greenfield land in that development, and it must not be touched because it will fragment what's left of Robsack and Churchwood. It will split them apart. And I agree that those other houses, there's 100 houses there, it should never have happened. It happened. You've given me the impression that we should shut up because we live there and we shouldn't complain. I am bitterly complaining. I wish I'd known before. I would never have bought a house in that situation.
Yes, certainly. Can I just go around and see if anybody else has got any comments, and then if you could answer all of them. So, are there any other comments? Yes, Dr. Joyce.
Just two very brief and general, but I think important points. I think on the basis of what we've heard from the council, we wouldn't fully accept that some of the more detailed points can't be included in the plan. These are matters that relate to policies only in application. We feel that the plan itself can be sharpened up in terms of a number of the criteria. And the other point we want to make, because the council have referred to it, Mr. Phillips has referred to it, we fully recognise, as I originally said, that there are resource constraints upon the council, manpower, finance, and that there are difficulties involved in dealing with private owners of properties. But what we feel the plan lacks is an indication of determination, what I would call bottom line determination, on the part of the council to make certain of these things an absolute priority, notwithstanding the difficulties that we all recognise that face the council and face all of us in this respect. So we would like to see the plan sharpened up in those two respects at least.
Right. I mean, I'm just wondering about have we got introduction, overall approach, vision, that sort of thing. Yes, I just wondered if, I'm thinking around whether there could be a statement along the lines that the council values the historic and natural assets, but at the same time has to balance those considerations against the need for, I don't know, something like that. I mean, it's
our apprehension about that, sir, would be that it's relatively easy to make statements of that kind in a major policy document. Less easy for us to see how, in actual practice, the council is committed within the restraints that we've recognised, is really genuinely committed to doing something about the aspects. Yes, there must be a balancing act going on, but we want to see real evidence in the plan of commitment on the part of the council rather than generalities. Like that.
I mean, don't you think that the mere publication of a local plan demonstrates commitment?
No.
No.
Just a thought. Right. Yes, Mr. Wise.
Well, I'm very perturbed. There's two ponds at Little Robsack Wood. That's where the badgers get most of the water from Churchwood, the surrounding areas. The next important thing is, if I wanted to build there, how am I going to properly accommodate, for example, just the crested newts? They have a breed in the ponds, or one or two, so you usually have more than one pond because of droughts. You follow how that works. And then during August, September time, you might find them 1,000 metres away. In other words, up in the Churchwood somewhere, under some rotting logs and things like that. And it's almost impossible now, anywhere in Hastings, we've got to the point we keep going, build, 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 build. We either got to make up our minds and perhaps put it in there that from now on we euthanize all wildlife on each site so that the builders can do what they like. It's really down, we're down to that point. Wherever you go, Archery Road, that you're not involved in, is a good example, because where it's a wonderful little island with wildlife on it, and if I build on it, which I'm not disputing that people shouldn't build, if I build on it, what do I do with the wildlife? Because it's all houses all round it, it's an island. And we've got to that point in Hastings. We're not the same as Rother and other places.
You have made that point.
Yes, thank you.
Right. Yes, Mr. Newbold.
Yes, I just would like to remind Mr. Phillips that he said plan-led, and I would think that to indicate any plan was useful, and I do not really think his comments about a 1930s plan are not relevant, especially when it actually shows what the community's been doing with the site since that length of time. A lot of the community is not aware of what you do with your reports or management reports. They just look at the site as it is and what they can use it for. And these things that we do in a planning environment are something they don't always see until actually planning occurs. And on this particular site that we have an interest in, we have had so much planning in ore. We've got such a high density. We have one little island left.
Okay.
And that is so much wanted by our community that, as you've already heard, there is a huge amount of animal life, species and taxon packed into that site, and it has no designation.
Okay, right.
This can't be right.
Yes, Ore Valley.
Well, I really want to talk about something that's not really necessarily covered in these sessions, and that's about the infrastructure. We were talking about flooding.
Yes, there is a separate session on monitoring and infrastructure.
Right, okay. Yeah. It was really just to pick up on what was being said about flooding and about wastewater and sewage issues, because there is a big problem in Ore Valley with a Victorian sewage system which has got a lot of common sewers, very unsatisfactory. And of course that has a major impact on development sites anyway. So apart from wanting to protect green space, there are also a lot of constraints and issues which make further development, particularly in Speckled, very unsatisfactory, and there's land stability issues as well. So it's another element of the issue which is very, very important to any development sites. Just wanted to make that.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Hollage.
Yeah, just a couple of points to pick up on what Mr. Newbold said and also the lady to my left. It does relate to my client's site, but it is a more generalised point, and I think Mr. Newbold has said on a few occasions over the last couple of days that there appears to be 8 sites of nature conservation importance which have been removed from the plan. I'm not sure why. And the lady to my left surprised me today by telling me that there's actually 5 of these sites have housing allocations on. And I'd just like to know, and this is where it relates back to my client's land, is that for 30 years the council sold their land originally in 1973 for housing development. And for over 30 years it's been a housing allocation until Mr. Davison did his survey in 1996. And in my Freedom of Information request, I'm told that designation for 1996 followed into the 2004 plan. Well, that's not actually true, because in the Hastings local plan pre-inquiry changes, October 2011, the site was allocated for housing development under policy H1, and again in 2002 under the Hastings local plan, further proposed changes, the site was allocated for housing development under policy H1. There seems to be quite a random approach to these sites as to are they sites of nature conservation importance? If so, how important is that designation? In some instances, it appears that they're suitable for housing development. In other cases, they're not. In other cases, well, let's just remove them. They're no longer important. So I'd just like to know how these what the approach is to these, and I think the lady to my left has some concerns on how these are designated and what the process is for reviewing them and for deleting them and so forth.
Okay. Brooks, did you?
Sorry. Yeah, well, obviously the 2009 SNCI sites review was part of the evidence base that's been provided, and I think the document number has already been put to you. Yeah, I mean, I guess sort of looking within that, there's certain information that suggests and makes recommendations, and I think it's up to 5 or 8 sites are deselected, but I couldn't find anywhere within that information about then what the process was for the deselection and how Hastings Borough Council would take that to committee or anything like that. So perhaps that's clarification that we could see from that matter.
So are there, yes, Mrs. Brown.
Thank you very much. With respect, I don't feel I can accept Mr. Phillips' explanation of Robsat. I think I have to come in and look at all the details, because it isn't my recollection at all. The inference being that if there was a larger area of land, and we're lucky now to have only that much that's needed to be built on, according to the proposals. And I need to look at ownership, I need to look at the stages of development around there, because I was involved at the time. It's not my recollection at all. So I think probably, I don't want it to go unchallenged this time.
I mean, I think the basic point, I will be looking at the site as it is proposed to be allocated, and obviously looking at the surroundings to see how it relates to the surroundings.
Oh, yes, well, I'm sure you'll be very, you'll find it very interesting.
I'm sure I will.
Important, not to just let that statement go by.
Yes, Mr. Stevenson.
Mr. Hollis, I'm really sorry to labour the point, but I haven't got an answer as to why that particular important piece of woodland was taken out of the open spaces strategic assessment. Because on the chart it's rated as high value along with Churchwood. Something's going on in this council to actually do something to that woodland to make it as it's nothing at all. I mean, why did Mr. Cookson write and say it's not in the open spaces strategic assessment? How could you do that without going to committee? Because it is part of Churchwood. They are both historical woodlands going back to 16 whatever, and yet somebody with a stroke of a pen decided to deselect it. I kind of understand. I know I'm talking about my site, but it wouldn't matter to me if it was miles away from here. It is so worrying as to how they could do that.
Can I try and reassure you, Mr. Stevenson? I mean, whatever has happened in the past, it is before me now.
Right. It isn't in my submission. It is the most shocking thing. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And then Mr. Dine said to me, it's a mistake, Mr. Stevenson. I will make sure it's done properly for the next exhibition. Back comes Mr. Cookson. It's not a mistake. It isn't included. And I thought, well, I'm quite a novice in this, and I haven't lived here that long, but surely that doesn't make sense.
Well, I will deal with it now as part, and I promise I will.
Because it really has upset me, you know. All right, thank you very much. I rest assured.
Yes, Ms. Jarvis.
I was just wondering, you said that you were going to make some recommendations about the council redrafting the policy HN6.
HN6, yes.
On the name and on the convent of the Holy Child of Jesus.
Yes, I will do.
Yeah, and will you put that in the inspector's documents or something like?
I will try. Yes, I'll do it as
so
soon
that
as
it's
I
publicly
can.
accessible.
Oh yes, certainly.
Yes,
and everybody will have an opportunity of having a go at it.
Yes, yeah, so
I mean,
I'll have notice. Yeah, absolutely. I'm in agreement with having to go. Okay. Thank you.
Right, well, I would, we've had all the afternoon at this.
I just
are there any fresh points? And then I will ask the council to respond. So, Mr. Ingleton.
I thought you were about to finish, but my concern is that there seems to be a large amount of information available to yourself and to the council, and over here we don't seem to have it. There seems to be a distinct shortage of a lot of the documents that are going around. Would you ask the council to put all the information on the website so at least we can brief ourselves for next week? The IT is a bit appalling.
So not only Mr. Holt, she still can't print stuff off. I've had to get an IT expert to convert the PDF documents on this examination library into an Adobe readable thing to print. And I spent half of last night printing stuff off for several people. You just you print this page and it doesn't work.
Oh, I thought I was the only one.
No, it's ludicrous, and that examination library is so comprehensive and huge. You think, oh, I found what I want. You go to print, won't do it. You have to convert it. Isn't that right, Mr. Newbold?
Yes, it is. Well, there are still IT problems. We were only told today that we could access publications from the library, which is very welcome. Because of the problems of actually getting hold of the material. That's something I would have liked to have seen earlier on, but as we do now have it, and the programme officer has actually been very helpful to do that, I think everybody needs to be aware that if you can request these documents, and basically it needs to be done with enough time for the hearings as well. I'd like to echo Ms Stevens' point about the fact that I think the public feel that Speckled Wood is in the same situation. There has been a definite point of marginalising this woodland and making it something that it actually, so it appears as small as it possibly can. I don't know what the agenda is here, and I hope that does really stop with you, and we do get some seriously good decisions being made about these woodland sites and these natural sites that are around us. I would like to also say I would commend Alexandra Park for the work that they've been doing trying to clear up the water. At Speckled Wood, we are very wary of this. We have been trying to put catchment ponds in as well. We do have issues there with land ownership, which means they get took out regularly. We've been working with the EEA to actually try to improve the water that runs through the site. And I think that Alexandra Park has seen the benefits of that as well.
Thank you. Mr. Hollage, did you wish to say anything further?
I'll just put my glasses on.
Right.
I will if you want me to.
I'll resist the temptation. Yes, Mr. McKinley.
Just one quick point about the protection of assets, which I think is the rubric for this session. Last night I revisited the Council's website, and I thought things might have changed since the last time I checked this, but it hasn't. In the matter of conservation areas, there's no separate entry for conservation areas. It's buried under something else. If you go to there, no maps are available to tell you what parts of the borough are referred to by these designations. There's no list. Mr. Phillips mentioned management plans. They've been a long time pending, and there's still no management plans for the conservation areas. The Council is very careless of its responsibilities in this matter, I feel.
Right, so if you would like to respond to all those points.
Okay, I'll try to say, I don't think, with respect to some of them, many of them are either repetition or I think can be dealt with or will be dealt with under separate matters. The convent policy, for example, and the issues around that, I think that Mr. Hollage's concerns can be addressed and no doubt will be in detail when we deal with Matter 5 and the emission side. We've had various comments. You, sir, will have seen, and Mr. Hollage has now accepted, he has received the Freedom of Information response. I would like, if I may, just to reassure Mrs. Stevenson, in view of her comments, that I was not in any way implying any personal slight on yourself. I don't even know where you live. I made a comment on the basis of the representations that we have received, many of which have been from that area. I don't think either I called anybody a NIMBY, and certainly I did not use your words, which was suggesting that you should shut up. Everybody's view is valid, and I did say it is not unsurprising in a planning matter for people to be protectionist of their environment. That was the point I made. When I spoke to this plan, and I'm not certain when Pamela Brown was a councillor at Hastings, but all I mentioned was this was the plan published by the council that you were a councillor for, and it shows a larger area at Robsack for residential that is now developed. I will show you this plan before we leave tonight. That was the point I was making. Mr. Newbold then was saying, well, in a plan-led system, what's the purpose of a 93 plan? I wasn't suggesting this is the plan forward any more than your 1930s borough plan. It was to show you that things change. The last lot of housing that was required is built, is occupied, and we need another lot of housing, wherever we can try to find that, whether it is on Speckled Wood, on Mr. Holledge's emission site, or wherever else. But that is the task that we face. That was the only point I was making in respect of that and a plan-led approach as opposed to a developer-led approach without a plan in place where appeals will go off in all directions. You won't get 106 contributions, you won't get ecological mitigation on allocated sites, will be, I would suggest for you, a much worse situation. I know that Eamon Murphy, sir, has been very patient waiting this afternoon, would just like 5 minutes to talk maybe about some of the issues on the built heritage and in respect of a couple of comments made recently from the corner, sir.
Okay, yes.
Sir, I will be very quick, knowing your time constraints. I think Hastings Borough Council and the people who live here are very fortunate to have a planning strategy that postdates the NPPF. It's sound, it's up to date, it's not silent, it's not absent, and I sit in many inquiries going through these issues. We have policy EN1, which we've all seen the inspector's report on. I think it was you, Mr. Hullox, who was that inspector.
Very clear.
Where you actually identified the policy saying that the policy EN1 provides sufficient protection, preservation and enhancement of the built environment, and that certainly would accord with the intentions of the NPPF, which superseded PPS 5. And obviously all decisions are to be made in accordance with the development plan, and this document, as you said, will form part of that development management policies. The policies that we have before us build upon policy EN1, and that's very clear to read when you go through the bullet points that are in EN1 itself and then follow through. There's a natural sequence. And I hear that Hastings, some criticisms about their, I shouldn't use the word devotion to the heritage environment. In fact, Hastings are one of the boroughs in the South East who are immensely commended for their work and their efforts. Generally throughout the planning professions, the Institute of Historic Buildings and Conservation, of which I am a member, through English Heritage, who are now Historic England, trying to compete with Historic Scotland. And if you look at policy EN1, it does actually say in the first sentence onto the second sentence, 3 years from the adoption of the Development Management Plan, they will develop a historic environment strategy for the conservation of the historic environment. And it goes on a few lines about dealing with neglect, decay, other threats, and will reinforce the historic environment record for the borough. And those policies are very much being followed through, that the efforts have been placed on the planning strategy and the DNP that we have here before us. And I'm sure you will, a number of you will be aware of the work that was put into the Archery Road application site when it went to appeal. And whilst the inspector acknowledged that there was no appraisal document for the conservation areas in question, and I say that in plural because of the number that bordered the conservation area in which the Archery Road site was situated, but she commended both STAG, the local authority, that was myself who was representing the local authority, and also, strangely, the appellant, because a lot of the information that was brought forward, which was sourced locally, was proffered by the local people, showed that we all, no matter what side we were on, came together with a consensus and had common ground about the importance of the historic environment. And I think that certainly is something that's coming through with the policies that we have before us in the DMP.
Thank you. Right. Yes, very briefly, Mr. Ingleton, very briefly.
On the Archery Road, there was an application put in for a huge development with a large amount of flats, which was recommended by the officers, and it was turned down. It was the local people that went there to put the effort in. We didn't.
And it took 3 years.
Could I just add that I was appointed by the council to defend the committee members' decision, and it was a hard case. There is a background document, I think, that includes the evidence that was put forward, and that appeal was dismissed quite rightly. And I think we can make available the inspector's appeal decision.
Well, as I say, the local plan is to take us forward. I really do
really short.
Yes.
Well, right, very quickly then.
Very quickly, Mr. Davidson did a wonderful report in 1986 and said himself, put down in his statement, that Rob Sackwood's area should never be developed.
I've seen that.
Thank you.
I've seen that.
Yep.
Yes, Mr. McGinley?
The documents are full of fine words. There's not a proper assessment of the extent to which they conflict. And in terms of recent cases, I commend the reports that the Council has had to commission on the Country Park debacle and the mistakes that the Planning Department made there.
Yes, I would say the same thing. I don't believe there's been proper assessment. I'd like to see, if the SPD was being applied to HN7, I'd like to see that applied to HN8 as well, to reinforce that as well. I do believe there should be more accessible to these things. I think some of the problems with the IT, if I may say, are due to the way that the PDF documents are being created. I don't believe they've been created with an Adobe creation system, and they're a mix of portrait and landscape documents, which are incredibly hard to print.
Mr. Holly?
Very quick point, I didn't get an answer to my question about the random designation of FNCIs and why some are considered suitable for housing development, whereas my client's site has no nature conservation interest on it and has been omitted.
Mr. Arnold, I'm quite happy to bring that back when I come back at one of the focus areas, and I'll explain the criteria.
Happy with that? Yeah. Good. Yes, Dr. Jones.
Very, very brief remark. We are going forward, as you say, sir, but when we look back at the past, we must surely learn lessons from the past. And the archery ground is a perfect example of where local people essentially turned upside down the council's approach. So the council surely must learn from that, and indeed that applies right across the board. That's the only remark I would make about the past and the future. So.
Yes, the past can inform the future. We learn from our mistakes.
Hopefully.
Good. Right. Thank you. So we resume on Tuesday morning. Are we here or downstairs? Do you know where we are?
Downstairs.
Downstairs. Right, okay. So the hearings are therefore adjourned next Tuesday morning. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hollock. Thank you for your time.